This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
Aaron, great to see you.
Mike, good to see you too.
We're continuing our study of the Federalist Papers today. If you recall, Federalist Paper 23 is about the need for a government at least as energetic as the one proposed. And what we've seen from papers 23 through 29 is Publius take up that question of energy in terms of common defense. And so here in 27, 28, and 29, we're rounding out that concern over common defense in light of two different objections. Federalist Papers 27 and 28 are taking up the objection that federal government as proposed through the Constitution will not be able to execute its laws except by use of military force. And then Federalist Paper 29 is taking up the objection that the Constitution and Union as proposed should not have the power to regulate the militia and deploy it against insurrections and seditions. So that's where we are in the Federalist Papers. So, Aaron, let's get to work.
Very good, Mike. Thank you.
It's a basic fact that government has to have the ability to enact and execute its laws. So it must have the power to make laws and execute them. And it must have the energy to execute them. So it's one thing to say I have the power. You might think of this in terms of the right. Yeah, I must have the right to make the laws and to carry them out, but I also have to have the means of carrying them out, which I would call the energy. So how is it then that this federal government is going to have the power to make these laws and execute them? I think we should keep in mind some of the arguments from Brutus I. Does that seem right to you? Publius is obviously responding to Brutus in these papers. And I'll just be very succinct. Brutus says the proposed national government will be too big and too far away to know your interests and make laws that are responsive to your interests. And insofar as all of this will be strange to you as the citizen, you will be disinclined to obey, and the federal government, as proposed, will then use the military to force you to obey, thus ending liberty. Vote no, says Brutus. Publius is now responding to that concern.
So paper number 27 begins, it has been urged in different shapes that a constitution of the kind proposed by the convention cannot operate without the aid of a military force to execute its laws. Right? We're presented at the very beginning with the problem that Publius is going to need to respond to, that the anti-federalists are whipping up fears that this government will require, military force, a standing army, something like the National Guard in the streets to be able to enforce the law. You gave me a look when I said that just now.
I don't even know what you're referencing there. What are you even talking about?
There are signs that people have spray painted all over the sidewalk. Free DC. I have to say, I was in Union Station yesterday, and it was a very pleasant experience. Anyway, getting away from any of that. We see the problem here at the very beginning. The anti-federalists are whipping up fears that executing the law within this constitution will require military force. And Publius dispenses with this very quickly. He does not at first tell us that the government will have no need of a military force to execute the laws because, let's say, there are going to be other agents to do so. Right? He asks, why would people want to disobey? What would stop people from following the laws as they would be expected to? Unless we presume at the same time that the powers of the general government will be worse administered than those of the state governments, there seems to be no room for the presumption of ill will, disaffection, or opposition in the people. I believe it may be laid down as a general rule that their confidence in and obedience to a government will commonly be proportioned to the goodness or badness of its administration. So the quality of the laws, first of all, and then the quality of their execution, that is, people's interaction with the government when they see with their eyes, feel with their hands, how this government is working, that will answer the question of whether they want to obey. Remember that although this is a people that have just resisted tyranny, I think Publius realizes that the lawgiver here is working with human material that is generally obedient to law and respectful of institutions that have been created, let's say, through history or have been created by the consent of the governed. We're not asking how we're going to have a bunch of unruly school children obey the schoolmaster. Right? We're talking about how to make a law-abiding people obey the law. And simply, he says it's up to administration of what we might call the efficacy of the government.
And it's the efficacy of the government not merely in terms of efficient administration, because efficient administration of bad laws is no good. I mean, you could say there's super efficient administration of laws in a despotism. So that's not sufficient. My reading of good administration here in the opening paragraph of Fed 27 means laws that meet your interests. And you would add to it, if you make a law that on paper will meet my interest, it must also be administered in the way that you and I would use the word administered today. So it must be a good law that's also executed well, carried out well. I think Publius is thinking of all of that in the use of his term administration here. So it's a lot of fun to think through. Efficiency in terms of its being exacted does not at all a good law make. And you can have the best laws in the world, but if they're not carried out, let alone obeyed, they're not good laws either. It's a really fun point here.
Yeah, I mean, let's just say that his definition of good administration has to match with his definition of good government.
I think this is right. Yeah, I think you're onto something.
And we spent a little bit at the end of last episode reminding ourselves or learning what we had learned from the previous papers to update our definition or to refresh ourselves as to what Publius thinks good government is. And good government is Republican government, right? It's not just Republican government without the improvements in political science that have been taught by experience that have to be explained to us and announced by him, right? We have to put some qualifiers on it. We have to remember back to Fed 10. It's not democracy, but it's not simply despotic government. Because, as we would say, China has well-administered government as far as I understand.
And you're right also to think this way, in my opinion, because Publius is going to take us there in a moment. Paragraph 2 is going to take us back to Fed 9 and Fed 10 and actually offer some new things to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Still worried about faction. Faction then is a question of securing your rights and the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So you and I wrestled with that way back in Fed 10. Publius is going to start talking about that stuff very soon. But before that, he says something wonderful towards the end of paragraph 1. I'm picking up where you left off, Aaron. I believe it may be laid down as a general rule, Publius says, that their confidence in and their obedience to a government will commonly be proportioned to the goodness or badness of its administration. It must be admitted that there are exceptions to this rule, but these exceptions depend so entirely on accidental causes that they cannot be considered as having any relation to the intrinsic merits or demerits of a constitution. These can only be judged of by general principles and maxims. Haven't we been doing this since Federalist Paper 23, at least, in our concern over exigencies?
Like, at the risk of being out over our skis, let me read something from the last paragraph, and then we'll consider what's in between this sandwich. Any man who will pursue by his own reflections the consequences of the situation will perceive that if its powers are administered with a common share of prudence, there is good ground to calculate upon a regular and peaceable execution of the laws and of the Union. So that elasticity that you're looking for comes in the fact that this government has room for prudence to operate, for prudent men to be prudent. And what we're going to see in the second paragraph and onwards, until we get to this final 6th paragraph again, is that the wisdom of the legislator, the wisdom of the people matters very much. And this is another paper, I think, where the person who is responsible for executing the militia, by which I mean commanding it, the commander-in-chief, has withdrawn again from this paper. He is not present. And that's extremely telling, I think, for the way that Publius is structuring this argument.
Yeah, we've been paying attention to the House, the most popular branch thus far. And then where's the executive? We haven't seen him since 23. And the Senate is going to arrive in this paper here. But before turning back to paragraph 2, I would like to offer my somewhat smart aleck reading of what you just read to us, Aaron. In this line, if its powers are administered with a common share of prudence, there's good ground to calculate upon a regular and peaceable execution of the laws of the Union. Why not read this way? This machine is so good that a normal person with a common share of prudence, which means to say nothing exceptional, what's commonly found, a person with a common share of prudence, therefore, what's often found, is capable of allowing this machine to produce laws that are regularly and peaceably executed. While you say, hey, look, there's a place for prudence to flourish in this Constitution, I would point out, well, wait a minute, but this isn't high. It's just the common share of prudence. Yeah, this is Joe Six-Pack level prudence. But do you read this way? I mean, does my reading have any purchase with you is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'd remember that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm.
Yeah, so then it's a testimony to the quality of the machine, that it doesn't take exceptional human beings. All the better if they're there. But all it needs is just normal people. In a paper that 4 paragraphs ago was talking about the exceptional quality of the representatives in the Senate in particular. If it's okay, let's turn to paragraph 2 here. Publius is going to offer us a catalog of 4 things.
Hey, sorry. One thing. I remember in a previous conversation, I think somewhere around Federalist 16, you said that you recalled one of your teachers saying something about the line.
Yep, you're right. You're totally right to bring that up. That if the federal government is administered better, the loyalties of the people or affections of the people will tend to that.
Yeah.
That people love most that which is best. Correct? Is that what you're thinking about?
That's
and we
right.
spoke of it. I said, Charles Kessler, I once heard Charles Kessler speak of that as a loophole big enough to drive a Mack truck through. That's what you're thinking about right now, right?
Yeah. I think about that often.
Well, Kessler's pretty clever, pretty good guy. But you're right, because this is now, these papers are about a soft power that leads people to obey. The opening paragraph of Fed 27 says, look, if the laws are good, well administered, they meet your interest, you're going to follow them. Where are you going with this remembering Fed 16 bit?
We've articulated a pretty substantive definition of what good administration is that isn't simply the laws ought to be executed. That said, as a lover of liberty, anytime I hear the word administration, possibly because of modern connotations about the word that Publius doesn't necessarily have, I get nervous. And so while I do want to endorse this Constitution and I want to come to a more enlightened endorsement of it than I would have before reading Federalist 27, I still want to remind myself of the limitations of the argument, which is that, as Professor Kessler said, that can be read very expansively. Publius is not the kind of political scientist who, with equal alacrity, can make recommendations to tyrants as well as to humanitarian statesmen. At the same time, I want to make sure that this Constitution has levees for my freedom that will not break.
Nice.
And administration is a place where that can be called into question.
Look, once people see this government administer good laws well, the people will attach to it. It seems that seeing this government in action, especially in your daily life, will breed a sort of affection for it. But it's weird because the Constitution will be out of sight and at a distance, and the federal government should be too. We have to keep in mind, this is prior to the rise of the administrative state. It seems that love here, or affection for the government, is the soft power stand-in for hatred of the law, or distance from the law that would find you not obeying it, that would then force the federal government to use the military to execute its laws. So Publius here is saying, we're not going to use the military, we're going to use good administration, and then my understanding of human behavior allows me to say human beings will admire and have affection for good laws and therefore obey them. And good laws, therefore, are necessary. So it's a way of engineering the necessity of good laws in a liberal government. Liberal government has within it the seeds of liberty. And also, whenever it's poorly administrated, you're going to say, yeah, it's going to turn into despotism and have to use violence against us. And Publius is going to take that very seriously very soon and remind us of a fundamental right that might have to be invoked on such occasions. But here's what I want to say. That line that you're thinking of back from Fed 16, you and I also interpret it as saying, so state governments do your job well. Because if you're not doing your job well, people are going to break up with you and fall in love with the national government. That was a sort of exceptional situation, it seemed to me, back in 16. But now in Fed 27, the exception seems to be the rule. The federal government will be better administered, and therefore the people should have more affection for it. Force will therefore not be used because the law should be cherished. I mean, look at how beautiful this is. It should be cherished, voluntarily obeyed. So how could Publius possibly say such beautiful things? Paragraph 2 of Federalist Paper number 27 reminds us of Publius's new or improved political science, especially in terms of its ability to deal with faction and overcome the maladies which so beleaguered the petty republics of antiquity. In paragraph 2, Publius says, various reasons have been suggested in the course of these papers to induce a probability that the general government will be better administered than the particular governments, the principles of which are. And then he proceeds to offer us 4 different aspects of the national government that render it superior to the various state governments. Now, I'm not going to read them all. It's quite lengthy section, but I'll just say. Foremost, the enlargement of the sphere is going to present a greater number of possible representatives to the people. This is Republican Principle 101. And then after that, through the medium of the state legislatures, who are to select senators, there's reason to expect then that the state legislatures will have better quality human beings, let's say greater lovers of justice, maybe more prudent human beings. They will be selecting senators who have hopefully greater knowledge and more comprehensive understanding of things in these national councils in particular. And then finally, because of the enlargement of the sphere, again, the representatives will be less likely to be tainted by the spirit of faction, and it will be harder for them to get involved in forming factions. So Publius has here said the national government is going to be better administered than the various state governments because of the enlarged sphere. And the enlarged sphere stands to offer us a better quality of representative and also a cure for faction. Therefore, you should love it more and obey it. And it's not going to have to use the military to get you to obey. He says, look, several additional reasons of considerable force will occur to fortify that probability when we come to survey with more critical eye the interior structure of the edifice which we are invited to erect. The point is, as Publius says, these 4 things aren't all. He has more tricks up his sleeve. We're going to turn to those tricks in volume 2, but for now, that's what he wants to hip us to.
Sorry, I'm keeping quiet because there's a fire truck on the street right now.
Publius rounds out the second paragraph saying the following. It will be sufficient here to remark that until satisfactory reasons can be assigned to justify an opinion that the federal government is likely to be administered in such a manner as to render it odious or contemptible to the people, there can be no reasonable foundation for the supposition that the laws of the Union will meet with any greater obstruction from them or will stand in need of any other methods to enforce their execution than the laws of the particular members. Because the federal government is going to make laws capable of meeting the people's interests and administer them well, there's no reason to suspect that they will need any enforcement mechanisms beyond what the states themselves already need. And in fact, it should be able to do a better job than the states. It should be able to make better government than the states themselves are. Because again, to repeat, how are they protecting you from faction? And what's the quality of representatives in your state in comparison with whenever you're only sending out 2 senators who have been elected by your state legislature, and so on and so forth? This is Publius's argument thus far. So cool your jets, Brutus. It's going to be okay, he says. Keep in mind that this is prior to the 17th Amendment, which calls for the direct election of senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, the state legislatures did so. So Publius here is championing that aspect of the Constitution. as readying it for good administration. What's cool about this list here in the second paragraph of Fed 27 is that it contains some new additions from Federalist number 10.
Well, Mike, I wanted to pose this to you as a question. We learn in this paper that on account of the extent of the country from which those to whose direction they will be committed will be drawn, the senators will be less apt to be tainted by the spirit of faction. Did we learn in Federalist 10 that the legislators were going to be less tainted by the spirit of faction?
Yeah, the closest I can think off the top of my head that we got to that is that there's a cooling off effect by way of being a representative of a larger number of people. You have to mediate multiple interests and are responsible to all of those interests insofar as they're produced by your constituency. And you've heard me talk about it this way before. I'm in a fight with my friend and you're friends with both of us. You're coming in to resolve it. You care about both of us, but you're not as hot as both of us are. You're cooler. And so it seems to me that the representative, the senator in this case, should be less, tainted by the spirit of faction for that reason. I might be missing something, but it reminds me of that argument from Fed 10 regarding the nature of the representative. And Publius also says there in Fed 10 that representative should be a lover of justice. So we don't quite get that far here. Rather, it's just by way of the mode of election and the pool from which these representatives, senators in particular, are gathered. And then in addition, we have to say the extent of the country. And that is from Fed 10, the extent of the country, because that's the larger number of constituents. Shouldn't this be all the better for the Senate because there's only two of them, as opposed to having one representative for every 30,000 people in the House? That's what's really cool about these papers is Publius has been arguing for the goodness of the House as the most popular branch, and now he's arguing for the goodness of the Senate, which you and I have to see is less popular. It's not the least popular. That's going to be, of course, the Supreme Court. But here, it's less popular, and that's a virtue for it. It's better. So bicameralism, legislative checks and balances, is back without actually being announced. What's new from Fed 10 that I'd like to point out is precisely this discussion of the Senate. Because there it was just representatives. It wasn't the Senate and the particular qualities of it. And also what's new is the relationship that the state legislatures have to the Senate, being another reason why the proposed federal government should be able to administer its laws well. Publius isn't done telling us about how we're going to deal with the problem of faction. So the enlargement of the sphere is offered as a cure for faction, Publius says in Fed 10. Publius also offers us representation. He's back here beating that drum, except now he's doing so in terms of the Senate and the state legislatures specifically. And what we should also keep in mind is something that Publius is going to announce, I think, in paragraph 4. Yes, in paragraph 4. Man is very much a creature of habit, Publius announces in 4. I didn't need him to tell me that, but he's going to rely on that aspect of us. Once the federal government is administered well, we should become habituated to that. And that ease with the sort of daily operations of this machine should lessen the likelihood of the necessity of using the military to enforce the laws. If the thing works well, we should like it and it shouldn't have to force us to obey. Furthermore, if the thing works well over any amount of time, we should become habituated to it, used to its routine operations, its hum and its buzz and its flow. And therefore, it shouldn't have to force us to obey. That could be a double-edged sword, because once we get used to it, maybe the good administration could level off or tend into the negative. And because we're used to it, we just, it's okay. It just doesn't work that well, but we're used to it, so it's okay. It's kind of like people staying in a bad relationship because it's familiar. So it could pose that danger, and you and I should recognize that. But that's not Publius's argument here.
I want to pick up from something he says in paragraph 4. We get very much the language of the passions and of affections. And most interesting to me of the human heart, I want to read two passages that are unconnected. The more the citizens are accustomed to meet with it in the common occurrences of their political life, the more it is familiarized to their sight and to their feelings. The further it enters into those objects which touch the most sensible chords and put in motion the most active springs of the human heart, the greater will be the probability that it will conciliate the respect and detachment of the community. Man, you've read, is very much a creature of habit. A thing that rarely strikes his senses will generally have but a transient influence upon his mind. A government continually at a distance and out of sight can hardly be expected to interest the sensations of the people. The inference is that the authority of the Union and the affections of the citizens toward it will be strengthened rather than weakened by its extension to what are called matters of internal concern, and that it will have less occasion to recur to force in proportion to the familiarity and comprehensiveness of its agency. Here's the passage that most interests me. The more it circulates through those channels and currents in which the passions of mankind naturally flow, the less will it require the aid of the violent and perilous expedients of compulsion. Now, I read that, particularly the parts about the passions of mankind, channels and currents through which they flow, and the springs of the human heart. And I get here on calling upon the mechanistic explanation of the human being and the artificial man at the beginning of Leviathan, and two, a deliberate attempt at softening, showing us that the modern state does not need to have recourse always to its sword. You can work on other passions besides fear in order to maintain obedience to good government. I think here that Publius is reading and invoking Hobbes, and at the same time showing us how good administration can, in some ways, render Leviathan dangerous but good.
Yeah, and while that image on the frontispiece shows the Leviathan holding the sword, what Publius is talking about is how, of course, you have the sword, but you need not always wield it in order to get people to obey. We could also think about this. You and I are making sure to steer clear of the way that we think of administration today. Because the way that we think of administration today and well-administered government is that it's fueled by experts and that it's expertise being deployed in an efficient manner, solving tomorrow's problems today, sort of thing. That's not it here. Part of what you read to us, Publius says that this government should be able to get our respect and our attachment. And so our respect should be a respect for it doing its job well, recognition that it's capable of maybe actually understanding our interests in certain ways better than we do. But I don't think it's going as far as contemporary administration in that way, where it's expertise that rules. Here it's responsibility that rules. And Publius has announced responsibility for the first time in Federalist paper number 23. And it's not, as I've said before, mere responsiveness. It's rather got something that looks like duty or caretaking about it as well. So here, Publius is also showing us that the government need not compel you to obey when it is capable of meeting your own interests in a way that is apparent to you or can be made apparent to you, even if you don't see it at first, as opposed to some mysterious expertise that seems so unnatural in terms of what it's forcing you to do. Here, there should be, by way of all this natural language, am I wrong in this, Aaron? With all of this fleshy, human, natural language, it should be some sense that this government is actually owning up to the nature of human beings while relying on the nature of human beings to keep from having to compel them. And again, let's repeat this point. Doing so is essential to liberal government because now I'm choosing to obey it. And it's making laws, my representatives, to whom I have delegated power, which is mine in the first place and always shall be, but I've delegated it to them, are making laws in my own interests, according with what? My nature. And what we can know about my nature in this book thus far is I desire to be secure in my persons and property. I mean, I'm jealous of my liberty. That's what Publius has been establishing thus far. So sort of the scope of government is what I'm trying to remind us of. The scope of government must be kept in mind because it also might show if the scope shifts radically, that good administration might actually turn into bad administration. It's just a hypothesis here, but I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Channels and currents, all this natural language is fantastic here. So this is the takeaway from this paper, it seems to me. Force is not necessary. This government can truly be a free government because law will be cherished and voluntarily obeyed when the federal government proves effective in its administration. And administration here means not merely efficient administration, but good laws administered well.
We get in paragraph 5 a reminder that the Confederacy, which does not have, that is the government the Constitution is aiming to replace, the government that does not have a fast recourse and a clear recourse to the sword, only has war as a means of enforcing the law. That is, if the only way I can enforce the law is by something extra constitutional, then I have an extra constitutional government that can only enforce the law by violence. And then we get a reminder of something we've seen before. By extending the authority of the federal head to the individual citizens of the several states will enable the government to employ the ordinary magistracy of each in the execution of the laws. So we don't have a situation in which there are, say, agents of national execution, or like we have today. Right? The national government can call upon the agents of the state in administering the law, and that too will make the national government more compatible to the people of the individual states, because they will see the operations of government conducted through people familiar to them. And of course, as we'll see later on, those people, the Marylanders, the Virginians who are executing the laws of the national government, are going to be the ones that are the most responsive to the individuals, and also possibly the people who could stand in the way of executing something unconstitutional or hostile to the liberties of Virginians, Marylanders, dare we say, Americans.
Remember, Brutus says in Brutus 1 that the federal government will only need the states if it needs them at all to carry out local administration. And I think we referred to this as the federal government is going to just pretty much suck all the air out of the room and only allow the states to breathe insofar as it needs them to do one or two things. Publius has here said the federal government's going to need the states to do a tremendous amount. It's going to need them to execute its laws to make sure that they're observed. And why you should want that, Brutus, and why Publius admits that he needs that, is because that familiarity that one enjoys with one's state will be used in service of obedience to the federal government, which will be distant. So the Constitution itself recedes from view because the people around us are administering the laws created by that constitutional government. And so therefore, it's using the states as a conduit, a peaceable conduit, which we would hopefully voluntarily obey. So federalism is now working in a very interesting way here in the service of liberty. And this is, again, what I really want to emphasize here. The alternatives here are very simple. You choose to obey or you're forced to obey. And choosing to obey is something that's really nice. It's something that a self-governing human being enjoys doing. Yeah, I like that. Let's do that, you say. And so that's what Publius is here showing, this virtue of this federal system and its federalism, is that it actually needs the states quite seriously in order to own up to its end of securing liberty. Beautiful point, I think. And look, man, let's return to this line, Aaron, that we read already. This is in paragraph 6, Federalist 27, quote, "Any man who will pursue by his own reflections the consequences of the situation will perceive that if its powers are administered with a common share of prudence, there is good ground to calculate upon a regular and peaceable execution of the laws of the Union. Public administrators should be activated or actuated by motives of public good and the obligations of duty." So that language reminds us of some of that language from Federalist Paper number 10 regarding patriotism and justice. So the characteristics now of the representatives and administrators of this government, at least a common share of prudence, some sense or care for the public good, and then also a sense of duty. And Publius isn't just relying on you having those qualities because you're a good person, Aaron. He's contriving the system so as to breed these habits and characteristics inside of you. This is the way in which we are receiving an education from Publius regarding the goodness of the proposed constitution. And also we can see that the occupants of the various governmental offices will undergo an education as well. Where you sit determines where you stand is one of my favorite turn of phrases. Where you sit determines something of who you are. Now, you have to have some of those qualities for the people to elect you into that position in the first place. That's right. And Publius is relying on that. But all the same, even once you're charged with this responsibility, I'm a good driver, and that's why you're entrusting me with driving your child around. But now that your child's in a kid's seat in the back of my car, I'm going to drive even better. That sort of way of thinking about it, I think, is at work here. And the education Publius is offering us, at least in Federalist Paper 27. Well, Aaron, look, we didn't have time to get to Fed 28 and 29, but I think what I said at the beginning of the episode still holds, and we'll get to 28 and 29 next. We'll try and treat them as a unit so we can round out this section before we turn to 30 and following. Aaron, it's been great seeing you. I can't wait to see you again and speak more about the Federalist Papers.
You too, Mike. Thank you.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.